Hi, this is Bob from INSYDIUM, and in this tutorial we're going to look at creating this strange orb. We'll be using the new xpStrangeAttractors modifier in xParticles 4, and then we'll look at rendering with Cycles 4D. Okay, so let's build the scene. So first of all, we're going to need to bring in a sphere object. So we'll bring in the sphere, and let's just have a look at the lines, and we'll make it a icosahedron, and we'll put those segments up to say 50. Good, so we want to look at the sphere, but we need to be able to see inside it. So we'll put on a Cinema 4D display tag, and we'll set that to lines, and wireframe's a bit dense, so let's put isopalms, and then we can see the sphere, but we can see what's going on inside as well. Good, so now we need to set up our xParticles. So we need an xParticles emitter, and by default it comes in as a rectangle. Well, a square emitter. So we're going to change that to a circle, and we can reduce that radius right down to, say, 1 centimetre. So as it stands, if we press play, it emits particles on the z-axis like that. So we don't actually need any speed. So under the emission tab, I'm going to reduce the speed to 0, and that'll do for now. Now this sphere is going to kind of encapsulate our particles, and they're going to rattle around inside it. So the sphere needs to be dynamic, and it needs a collision tag. So we'll go to tags, xParticles tags, collider, and that's applied to the sphere. Now the particles are going to be bouncing around inside the sphere. So we need to go to the collider tag and set the normals to inside the sphere. And I'm just going to reduce the bounce now. We can adjust this properly later, but I'm not going to need that much bounce, and we'll probably need a bit of friction, but we'll make those proper adjustments in a little while. Okay, good. So the sphere is ready to go. The only other thing about the sphere is that in the render, I had it slightly rotating, which just brought a little bit more interest to the render, and you got some kind of moving glints off the bump in the material. So to do that, you could just keyframe the rotation in the coordinates, but I like to use the MoGraph effectors to do this, because it means you don't need to use keyframes. And this is a bit of an underused feature, really. So if we go to MoGraph, to the effectors, and we select the time effector, let's make that time effector a child of the sphere. And then if we go to the deformer tab of that time effector, and we set the deformation to object, that will now affect the sphere, which is great. And by default, it's animating the heading over time. So it's spinning far too quickly. So let's reduce that to, say, I don't know, 10 degrees. Yeah, that's a nice slow rotate. That's what we want. But we don't want it to be perfectly rotating on that y-axis like that. So let's put a little bit of pitch as well. Maybe, I don't know, 3. So that's a really subtle rotation there that's looking nice. Okay, that's great. We can leave that. No keyframes necessary. That's done. Perfect. Right, so now we have our emitter. We want to start getting that dynamic shape that we got in the render, and we did that by using the new modifier inside xParticles 4, which is the xpStrangeAttractors. So let's bring one in. Go to the xParticles menu, modifiers, motion modifiers, xpStrangeAttractors. And by default, if I press play, the strange attractors will grab hold of the particles and force it along this fractal. But we can see that it's hitting the sphere, and it's not actually creating the pattern because it's being stopped by that collision tab. So what I'm going to do is use this scale value of the strange attractors. It's like a global scale modifier. I press play and reduce that down to, say, I don't know, 2 or 3. Now we're getting the pattern happening inside the sphere. That's what we want. I'm going to be slightly bigger, I think. Slightly bigger again. Okay. And then I'm going to just offset it slightly. So let's just stop that. And let's move the strange attractor and the emitter and just offset it slightly. So it's kind of happening centrally within the sphere. All right. That's looking good. All right, good. So it's not developing quickly enough, this pattern. It's very slowly making its way around. So let's increase the delta, which is like a speed control. And this is going to develop much more quickly now. There we go. That's whizzing on. Good. And I think we could perhaps offset those even more to get them. Yeah, that's nicer. Getting that pattern happening nearer the center of the sphere. Very nice. So that is all of the pattern for the Strange Attractor 1. Now what I want these to do is form this pattern and then dynamically drop to the bottom and then slide around the sphere as if there's a heavy gravity. So to do that, we're going to bring in a gravity object. So let's go to the xParticles modifiers menu, motion modifiers, and the XP gravity. We'll bring that in. I'm just going to hide the visibility of that so we haven't got all of these lines in our display. So if we press play now, nothing happens. That gravity is having absolutely no impact at all. And that's because if we go to the Strange Attractors, we have the type set to velocity. And in the velocity mode, this modifier will take over all control of the particle and no other modifiers will really do anything. But that's actually going to work to our advantage. Because if you notice, if I just disable this Strange Attractor, say now, they suddenly drop to the floor and are taken over by that gravity. And you get a really nice dynamic transition for free just by disabling the Strange Attractor. So we'll have it, disable it, and we get this really nice movement. Now, one thing that's going to help us a little bit later on in the render is if we offset this collision a little bit. And what we want is we don't want the particles to collide exactly when they touch this sphere. We want there to be a bit of a buffer. Now, because we are using the inside of the sphere, I'm going to go to the expand option of the collider and I'm going to put a minus value in, which means that they will hit the sphere before they do in reality. So it will create us a little bit of a 2 centimeter buffer, which will help with our reflections later on. So now we have got our Strange Attractor making the shape. We'll disable the Strange Attractor and there they go. Fantastic. So let's add a little bit of colour to these particles now, and we'll do that in the emitter settings. So at the moment, they are the default green colour. And let's make it a bit more interesting. So we'll make this first one I don't know, let's go for a really nice orange. A really nice orange colour for the first one. Nice. And that'll do for that. Okay, so now what we want is we want another pattern to develop once this one has dropped to the ground. So let's just go, say, to frame 70, and that's when we want our Strange Attractor to disable. So I'm going to go to frame 69 and hit a keyframe on the enabled button, then go to frame 70, disable it, and hit another keyframe. So now we have that automated into our scene. At 70, they drop. Fantastic. Now we also want the particles to stop emitting at frame 70 as well. Otherwise, we're going to get this constant stream of particles here going down to the end of the scene, which is going to look a bit rubbish. So we'll go to the emitter settings, we'll go to the emission tab, and instead of emit all frames, we will stop emitting on frame 75. Perfect. So that looks good for our first emitter. So there were 3 different emitters in the render that you saw for the sneak peek. Let's just do 2 to save time. So I'm going to take both the emitter and the Strange Attractor, and I'm going to make a copy, and automatically they're incrementally numbered. Now it's Strange Attractors 1 and emitter 1. So these are our new ones. So I'm going to switch off emitter, the original one. So now we have a new emitter, and it's the same as the old emitter. It is emitting orange particles. So let's change that to a nice blue colour so we have a bit of difference. And they're being affected by the same Strange Attractor. So before we move on, I want to tell emitter, the first one we made, that it should be affected by the first strange attractor, but it shouldn't be affected by the new strange attractor. So to do that, it's easy. We'll go to the emitter, to the modifiers tab, and in exclusion, I'm going to drag the new modifier into the original emitter, so it won't affect it. And in reverse, the new emitter in the modifier exclude, I'm going to exclude the original strange attractor modifier. Okay, good. So for this strange attractor, we're going to pick a different, one of the different presets. Let me just make this display a brighter blue so you can see it better. Let's just make it a bright blue for now. We can always change this later on. There we go. Okay. So instead of this default strange attractor Lorentz fractal that we're going to use, we're going to choose a different one. Now, these all provide very, very different results and different fractals. And then you can make further adjustments to the shape of these patterns by changing or even animating these constants. I'm not going to go into that now. You investigate those and have a look at how they act differently. I'm going to use, let's just use Chen for now. Now, I know that Chen is going to be, I'm going to need to reduce the global scale for it to fit within our sphere. And I know before pressing it that I'm going to have to increase the delta so it develops more quickly. So let's try that one. And there it goes. So we're getting a very different shape. Nice. I think that scale could perhaps be slightly bigger. So let's just try 3. I'd like it to get near the edges of the sphere. So that's actually colliding before it gets to the edge. So let's maybe try 2.5. We'll meet in the middle. Yep, good. Okay, excellent. So this is switching off at exactly the same time as our original strange attractor switched off, and we don't want that. We're offsetting this. So let's take the keyframes of our new strange attractor and let's move them forward, I don't know, let's say 100 frames. Okay? And our emitter, it's our new emitter, we want it to start emitting at, say, frame 100 and then to stop at 175. So now I'll put the original emitter back on, so everything should be working now, and we should get 2 patterns offset, and when they switch off, the particles fall and bounce around the inside of the glass orb. Here we go. So there's the first one, looking good. Drops, and second one appears, fizzes around, and then drops. Good. That's what I want. Excellent. So that'll do for the particle animations. We'll keep it really simple so we can move on quickly, but you obviously can animate yours and play with different modifiers and get much more intricate looks in your renders. So before we move on to rendering, let's cache that now because then we can kind of scrub forwards and backwards in the viewport, and it'll be easier working within Cycles 4D if we've cached up. So we'll go to xParticles, and we'll go to Other Objects, and we'll bring in a cache object. And we can leave everything default in the cache object. It'll cache everything that we need. The only thing I'm going to change, I'm going to go to cache type, and I'm going to set it to internal memory, which means it isn't going to create a separate cache file for every frame and save that in a folder. It's going to actually just save the cache details to memory, and then that'll be embedded within the .c4d file. For small systems, that's going to work perfectly for us. So let's just press build cache, and you can see it's whizzing through. It's pretty much doing it in real time, really. Slightly slower maybe, but there, we're halfway. It's making its way through, and it's reading all of this and writing it to memory. So it's going to be about 56 meg now it's finished. And now that it's cached, the cache objects turn red. Both emitters have received a cache tag, which are also red, and that means that it's reading this via the cache. It's not simulating it in the viewport, and that means we can scrub backwards and forwards in the viewport, and that's great. Okay, so that'll do us for simulating and caching the xParticles. Now we're going to move on to rendering. Now you could render this scene using the standard or the physical renderer in Cinema 4D, and you would use the basic xParticles shader to render the particles, and then you could use a Cinema 4D material with some reflectance channel settings to get the glass orb, and that would work fine. But we're going to use Cycles 4D for this render for fantastic realism and for speed of render. So I've just rearranged our workspace so you can see the various different windows we need to render with Cycles 4D. So I've got my viewport here in the top left. I've got the Cycles 4D real-time preview in this area in the right. And I've got my node editor here where we'll edit all of our materials. So let's start by having a look at how we're going to render these particles. To do that, we'll first make the sphere invisible so it's not going to block those particles. And for this, I want the particles to emit light. We want it to be a light material, not a diffuse material. So let's go to Create, and we'll make a Cycles 4D material, Surface Emission. And this emission brings up two nodes. There's the output node, which is going into the surface of the object. And then we have the emission node, and it's a strength of 1, and the color is just an off-white. So let's drag that emission node onto our emitter 1, the first emitter. And if I press play, we can see in the real-time preview, we're getting a real-time feedback, and it is rendering those particles with this off-white color. And the particles are a lot bigger in this display than they are in our viewport. And that's the way in which Cycles renders particles. It creates instances, and by default, those instances are spheres. And we can control those. And the way we do that is if we go to the emitter, we'll go to tags, and we'll go to Cycles 4D tags, and we'll click on the instance tag. And this instance tag tells you that they are sphere instances with 24 segments, which is quite a lot for this amount of particles. We probably don't need that many. Let's reduce that down to 7. We don't need that resolution. And we've got a size multiplier. And if I drop that down, you can see in real time, we're reducing the size of those particles in the real-time preview. Let's just leave it at about 27 for now. Okay, and then if I play through that, it's rendering almost in real time. And obviously it's display settings at the moment, but we can see those particles rendering. Excellent. And we can put that same material on emitter.1, the new one. And now both of them will be emitting with that kind of off-white color, and there is emitting a little bit of light. So again, let's give that one a copy of the instance tag, and then they will both be the same scale. All right, so that's that stage done. So what we want to do is we want the color that we defined in the emitter, there's a blue and an orange, to be respected by Cycles. And that's actually very easy. What we need to do is we need a particle info node, which is going to give the color to this emission node. So I'm going to right click in here, and we're going to go to Input and Particle Info Node. And we get this node. And look, all of these different bits of parameters are what we can pass on from the emitter to Cycles. And for this, all we need is the color. So we're going to plug in the color from the particle info into the emission. And now if we press play, the orange from the particle is being fed, and the blue from the other emitter is being fed there. Fantastic. And if we want to, we can increase the strength of this emission by increasing that. Excellent. And just to demonstrate that this is actually emitting light and it's not just coloured, let's just bring in a plane, and I'll just lower it into the viewport there. Okay. And now we can see that the orange particles are lighting that plane, and also the blue particles are lighting it with this hue round here. So we can see that that is actually emitting light. And once we get our glass sorted out, that's going to look really cool. Okay, so that'll do for now for the particles. We can make some adjustments, but they are textured and they're ready to go. So now what we want to do is we want to start making our glass orb. And because it's glass, we're going to be working with reflections. And if you're working with reflections, you need to create something to reflect into the glass. Otherwise, it'll just be black and look pretty terrible. So we're going to use a Cycles environment object to do this. And it's a little bit like bringing a sky object in regular Cinema 4D. So it brings in the environment and it creates a default background texture, which is this tag here. And if I click on that, and we can see in the node editor, this is what the background object is. So again, there's the output node plugged into the surface of the environment, and we have the background object, which again is just the off-white color. And what we want to do is we want to put an HDR kind of studio image into here, which we're going to use to make our nice reflections. So to do that, we need to plug the HDR image into this color input into the background material. So we need the correct node to do that. So if we click, right click, and if we go to, we want to go to texture, and we want to pick an environment texture, which brings up this node. And this node allows you, if we go to the attributes of the node, we can input a texture here. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go to the content browser of Cinema 4D, which I've docked here. And let's just open a search window. I'm just going to put HDR. So we're just going to search the Cinema 4D presets for HDRs that are there. And I don't really want photographs for this one. I want one of these kind of fake studios as the HDR for this. Let's have a look. Have we got any more? I want to use the inbuilt ones, so you don't need any other paid for plugins or any bought material to be able to replicate this. Okay, so one of these will do. Let's use this one. So we can drag this texture into the texture field, and you can see it's updated here. And now what I'm going to do is pipe that color into the color of the background material. And this will update in a second. You usually get a bit of a delay, and it's gone this this magenta color, which means that Cycles can't actually find the texture. And this is what happens when you drag a content browser image into a node. But if you just unselect load from disk, it will reload and find the image. All right. So now we have this image in our environment, and we can now see it in the background. So if I select the environment and hit our rotate object, we can then rotate it around and we can find a view that we want. So there we can see the kind of the back of the studio. All right, and at the moment it's not looking particularly nice, but once we get a reflective surface in there, it's going to start working for us. So let's make the sphere visible again. And there we can see it in our scene, and it's being lit by this environment object. Okay, good. So let's just leave that for the time being. So we need to make this sphere a glass object. So we need to create a new material to place on our sphere. So we'll go to Create, Cycles 4D, Surface, and there is a glass surface. So we'll create that, and here again we have two nodes to start with, the output node going into the surface of the glass of the object, and we have the glass node here. So let's put this glass object onto our sphere, and straight away we now have a bog standard glass material, and we can see the reflections of our HDR studio that we've just put in there. Okay. Good. Now at the moment, I know that the studio is way too light for the render. Now, there's a couple of things we could do here. We could go to the environment object and we could uncheck ray visibility on the camera, so it's only being seen by the reflections. But actually, I always feel that reflections feel more realistic if you see a little bit of the actual image that's been reflected in them anyway. So I actually want to keep that visible. But I just want to add a lot more contrast to our background image. So the way I'm going to do that, we'll go back to the background object. Here is our environment texture, which is the studio. And basically, I want to add a load of contrast to this. So the way I'm going to do that is right-click, and I'm going to select a color node, and I can make all of these different types of adjustments to images. So there's all kinds of, we could do this with gamma, we could do it with brightness and contrast. I'm going to get an RGB curve, and I'm going to place the color from the image into the RGB curve and then that color into the background. And now I can make adjustments on this curve to darken up this background image. So I'm just going to drag the highs down a wee bit, and then I'm going to make a contrast curve by dragging this way out. And now, so immediately you can see we add a little bit of contrast, we darken it up a bit, and it's looking way better already. Okay, that's actually a bit bright. Oh, those highlights so bright. Okay, that's starting to look good. I'm not going to spend hours messing around with this, so let's just leave it at that for now. Right, so we have a glass material, we have the background making those reflections, and we have our particles rendering. Okay, so the glass looks highly polished everywhere, and it doesn't look particularly impressive. And what we're going to do is we're going to edit that glass material, and we're going to feed in a noise-like texture into this roughness channel. Let's just, if we globally increase the roughness, you can see that it makes a much less shiny glass material. So that's what we're going to play with, but we're going to define where the glass is rough by using a pattern. So the way we're going to do that is we'll right-click, and we're going to go to texture, and the texture we're going to use, we could use a noise, we could use a Voronoi texture. There's lots of different ways we can do this, but we're actually going to use this wave texture. So what I want to do is, at this point, is show you a new feature in the latest release of Cycles, which is absolutely fantastic. If you click on the output channel of any node, it will immediately show you the output in the real-time preview. So this is the pattern that this node is, the wave texture node is generating. It's an incredibly useful feature. So we can see that it's developing a striped pattern, and on those stripes there's a gradient from black to white. So let's just feed this into the roughness and see what happens. Deselect that. So there, that's interesting. So there's the roughness, and then let's click on the color again. We can see the color. So what is happening is that wherever this pattern is black, there is 0 roughness, and wherever it is white, there is 100% roughness. And it's creating this look. So with that knowledge, we can now make some interesting patterns on where this sphere is going to be rough and where it's going to be highly polished and shiny looking. So we'll go to color so we can see exactly what we're doing. And before we actually start adjusting this shape and getting this shape, what I want to do is give it some texture coordinates so this node knows what shape it is being applied to. So to do that, we're going to right click, and we are going to hit input and texture coordinates, and we're going to get the generated coordinates from the sphere and put them into the vector. All right. So now we can start playing with these. Now I know that if I reduce the scale, it's actually going to make fewer stripes, but they will be bigger. So let's put this down to say 0.5. So now I've only got 2 stripes, so it's looking incredibly odd at the moment. But if we start adding a little distortion, we can see a bit more. We can start getting interesting noise style patterns. Okay, so let's just leave it at that. Now I'm going to start increasing the detail, and we can start seeing some very nice noise effects. And if we increase that detail scale, suddenly we're getting really nice noises. So I'm just going to leave it at that for now. So that looks interesting as we're viewing the color output of the wave texture. So let's deselect that and see how that looks with our roughness. So it's okay, but it's too rough. We haven't got enough areas of shininess. So what I think is going to be helped if we invert this map. So what is white is black and what is black is white. And I think that'll give us more areas of shininess without the roughness. So to invert this output, it's dead easy. All we have to do is go to right click. We're going to get a converter and we're going to get a color ramp. And if we put it in as default, we want the color into the roughness, not the alpha, nothing will change. Well, nothing will change. It'll slightly change. If I hit the color output of this color ramp, you'll see that the pattern is virtually identical, but the darker bits of the pattern will be slightly darker because they'll be fully black. Just watch. I'll click now. So it's slightly darker. So what this ramp is doing is effectively normalizing this. It's saying the darkest bit is black and the lightest bit will be white. And that's that. So what I want to do is invert this output. So we'll right click on that and put invert knots. And now we've inverted that and I want more black areas because I want more shiny parts. That's it. Good. So let's just have a look at what that looks like on our roughness now. So now we're starting to get closer to the look I'm after, with some parts that are rough, but then some parts that remain very shiny. This is looking nice. Okay. Now I don't want the bits that are rough to be 100% roughness. So to reduce that, I need to change this from white to more of a grey colour. And that's just going to reduce that overall roughness. All right, good. And if I just hit play, we can see that that pattern is then now going to be moving across as the sphere rotates. Nice. So what we can do to make this look even better and get glints off this is to add a little bit of displacement and bump. So we're going to use the same map. We're going to use this output map to say which parts of it are going to be bumpy and which parts aren't. So we can just pipe that colour into the displacement channel of the sphere and we automatically get some bump. Now to set what the bump is like, we can go to the material settings and into the displacement method, you can have bump, you can have true, which is actual displacement, it'll displace the geometry, or you can have both. So we're going to click both in this instance, so we get the benefit of both worlds. And there we go. So let's just increase my samples slightly so we get a slightly higher quality render. So we can just have a look at what's happening here. So now we're getting closer to the look that we want. We're getting these bumpy parts, which is really starting to spread out the reflections of the particles that are inside. So that's looking quite nice, I think. Now what I think we need to do is, let's just have a look. I think arguably there's slightly too much displacement here. So how do you reduce the displacement? Because we've got no slider to set how strong that displacement is. What do you do? Well, we use a math node and we're going to use a multiply node. And it's going to reduce the effect of that displacement, which sounds complex, but actually it's really easy when you get your head around it, and it provides you loads of control. So the way we do it is we right click, we go to converter, and we're going to hit a math node, stick it in, and we'll change it from add to multiply. And if we multiply it by a decimal value, it's going to reduce the effect of that displacement, and we can see it in the viewport here. There's less displacement and we're starting to get some really nice bumpy displacement here, which is doing lovely things with the reflections. So I think we could risk having, I think we could have some more brightness from this emission. So I'm going to go back to my emission material, which is on the particles, and I'm going to increase that strength to, let's say, 20. Okay. All right. That's looking nice. And let's just put a lot of samples in to get a nice high quality render. Move in a bit. And we're getting some really nice areas of bumpiness, which is playing with the transparency, and it's looking really nice. And as that rotates with the sphere, that's going to look really good. Nice. So the final thing we're going to look at is let's just go into a different frame with different colour so we just get an idea of what this overall scene looks like. So you see where it is black, it's not distorting the shape of the particle and the fractal at all, but then when we're hitting these bumpy bits, it's looking really nice and the light's kind of spreading across and it just looks, I think it's a fantastic look. Very simple. I mean, we're getting this very cheaply. Right, so the last thing we're going to do, which will really bring this to life and help the realism, is we're going to add a little bit of depth of field. So we need a camera for that. So if we go to the Cycles 4D menu, we'll bring in a Cycles camera. And what this does, it brings in a bog standard Cinema 4D camera, but it has a Cycles 4D camera tag attached to it. So we'll look through this camera. And what we want to do is add some depth of field. So we'll hit the Cycles 4D camera tag. And here we've got the depth of field settings at the top and we've got size. So if we increase this radius, it's going to increase the depth of field. And we can see that it's starting to blur in our viewport. So now we need to define where the focus point is. So to do that, we do that with the focal point of the camera actually. So let's just remove this display tag from the sphere so we can see it in our viewport. Let's go to the camera, and under the camera object tag, we're going to get the focus distance. We're going to click this picker and we're going to hit near the front of the sphere, not directly at the front, but near the front. Okay. So now we're getting some really nice depth of field. It's slightly blurred towards the edges of the sphere. And that's looking really nice. So one trick in my render, I had a very slow dolly in on the camera, so it crept in ever so slightly, which just brings a little bit more dynamism to the scene. So what I did to ensure that the focal distance remained accurate with that camera moving in is I created a focus object. So to do that, let's just zoom out a bit. All I did was create a null object, and let's call that null object focus. And okay, and then I just positioned it, moved it slightly nearer to the front where we want that focus distance to be. Play around with that, but let's just do it quickly. So in the camera, we go to the object tab and we can drag in our focus null as the focus object. And then no matter where you move the camera, it's always going to be focusing on that area. So if I now dolly in, it's still going to be focused in that same place. I can dolly right out and the focus will update as I want. And so in the render, I had a nice slow creep in like this as the animation progressed. Okay, so that's looking good for me. I'm happy with that. So what I'm going to do now is just show you a few tricks on how to get this rendered in Cycles once you're ready to do a proper output render rather than this real-time preview. So let's just pause that and switch that off. We don't need to look at that anymore. And in fact, I'll close that down because we don't need it. Right. So I'll increase this area and we'll go to our render settings. So here are our Cycles render settings. I've docked them here. So we've got the Cycles 4D render selected here. We've selected it. I've got it set to CUDA because I've got two pretty quick NVIDIA cards in here, two 1080 Ti's. So we've got it set to CUDA, so it will be benefiting from those. I can leave the tile order as default for now. And we can come down to the sampling, which is where we're going to get our quality. So if you're rendering glass with reflections and bump, there aren't any kind of written rules about this, but my advice would be you want to start at around 25 samples. So the higher these samples, the better quality your render will be, but the longer it will take. All right. So let's just start at 25 samples, and I'm going to leave absolutely everything else but as it is, as default. And let's just go to the output settings and we want to render the current frame. Okay, so I'll just render to this view and we'll see how long it's going to take. So with these cards, it's still pretty quick, even with that many samples, and it's looking really nice. So it's chugging through. I love the way that this emissive light is being distorted by this displaced and roughened glass. I just think it's a fantastic look that you get very, very cheaply. So that's finished rendering now. It took 22 seconds, and we can see that there's definite noise along here. So that's telling me a couple of things. Either that we haven't got enough samples, or it could be what are called fireflies that you get when you're rendering with reflections and emissive materials. So what I'm going to try is I'm going to keep the render samples at 25, but we're going to try using a bit of Cycles 4D denoising, which is a fantastic feature which can clear up a lot of grainy, noisy images. So I'm going to stick on denoising, and I like to reduce the strength to a lower number first. I'm going to reduce it to 0.2, and let's leave it as default for the time being. But here's an important tip, and remember this: if you are rendering an animation with more than one frame and you're denoising, always set your seed into the integer sampling to a value that's not 0. So 1 is fine, but set that, otherwise you're going to get discrepancies from frame to frame. So now we've added a bit of denoising. We're going to leave the samples exactly the same. Let's render. So this will render the samples at exactly the same speed, but then it's going to apply the denoising effect afterwards, so it's going to take a little longer. So the previous frame took about 22 seconds. My guess is this is going to probably be about, I don't know, 25 maybe. Okay, so it's moving through. Okay, and it's finished. So that took 29, and we've still got these kind of speckly points here. So the denoising hasn't helped us there. So my guess is that these are probably or possibly fireflies, which are kind of almost overexposed pixels that haven't quite got it right. So we're going to go back to the render settings, and to get rid of those, I'm going to try a couple of techniques. We're going to try and clamp the light values. So first of all, I'm going to clamp the indirect light values. Now this is a little bit unintuitive at first. If your clamp indirect is set to 0, it will have no effect. If it is set to 1, it has the strongest effect possible. And then if it's set anything above 1, that effect is reduced, which I know at first seems a little confusing. So let's just have it on full whack and see whether indirect clamping of the light gets rid of some of those noisier firefly pixels. So let's render again. Okay, there we go. So it looks like we've still got problems in this area. So we're going to try a direct clamp now, which is more severe. We don't really want to, you want to try and avoid clamping directly. So let's just try direct clamp of 5, which, remember, isn't strong. A direct clamp of 1 is full strength. A direct clamp of 5 isn't as strong as effect. Let's see if that makes difference to our render. So you'll notice when you start clamping the direct light that the overall light values will be lower. Your scene won't be as bright. But you can see immediately that has cleaned up those bright fireflies. They've gone now. Okay, and we still have a little bit of speckliness, which would be called noise here, but those bright fireflies have gone. So that has done us a lot of good. So we'll keep that at 5. That's looking fine. So let's just try a little bit more denoising, 0.5, one more render. And this will probably get us to the stage where we could actually do an animation render and get these knocked out. So as you play with your settings and you get somewhere that you think's okay, you then want to render out a sequence and render a few frames, say 10 frames at the settings that you've decided upon. And then you want to animate through those frames once they're rendered to see whether you're getting any flickering of noise. If you are, you need to increase your settings. And you'll start to kind of intuitively get to know what render settings you need for what image. But that's pretty much it. That is a basic introduction into rendering particles and some kind of nice glass displacement effects in Cycles 4D.